Well, welcome. Welcome to all of you for round 3 of this class on creation stories. And today and next time, we're going to go to the Bible. This is not a Bible study as such, but we are going to dissect what the Bible says about creation. So, how many of you were in church last Sunday? Okay, so you got a foretaste last Sunday of what we're going to be doing today, because we're doing with the second in the sequence of the Bible, but the first, the oldest creation story. And it begins with the creation of Adam and subsequently, and then goes to what is called the fall. More about that later as we continue. Question right here.
No, I was just gonna say, does being home with a heating pad, reading the day by day booklet, does that count?
Well, if you read the Yahweh creation story, then it counts. If you did something else, well, then it doesn't count. So, yes.
How do we know that the second story is the older of the two?
Well, the question is, how do we know that the Yahwist account of creation is the older of the two creation stories? I am not an Old Testament scholar, even though I delve in it quite a bit. But those people whose business is to study and dissect and work with the Old Testament are pretty clear in understanding that this is the earliest of the stories. How they arrive at that, I'm not privy to that process. But one point that I think needs to be made is that all of the Bible, including the New Testament, somewhat less the New Testament, but all of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, began with oral stories. In oral stories, if you want to get an image of it, is, people sitting around the campfire in the evening, and the storyteller would tell the story. And the storyteller were beholden to tell it right, but sometimes they would embellish it or change it or whatever. So anyway, the Yahweh story, which I'll say more about that, is likely to have been at least written down around the year 900 to 1000 BCE, before the Common Era, around the same time that the monarchy began, with King David and so on. But the antecedent of that story was around much longer before that. Just to summarize what I did last time, 4 strands of material are in the Old Testament, or in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they've been identified by the name of God, at least the first 2. So Yahweh is the first, or the oldest. That's what we're dealing with today. And the Elohist, E, is the second one, probably about 300 years later. And then the Deuteronomist, D, came out of the period in captivity where the Hebrew people said, something went wrong. We have to revisit who we are and what our roots were. And so the Deuteronomist history, the whole book of Deuteronomy, comes out of that period. And then finally, there's the priestly, P, which came after the return. And it was the priestly writers who not only added their own material, but combined the 4 strands into the present shape that we have. So that's a little bit of an overview of these different strands of material. As you are familiar, I have books which you can borrow, except you have to bring them back next week. So I just mentioned the J thing. This is the book of J. It's a marvelous book because it takes all of the J writings throughout that Torah and puts them into a sequence. So it begins, of course, with the story that we have today, but then continues on throughout and identifies what parts of the Old Testament they come from. So it's a wonderful book. And then the other book that I think you might find interesting, the Babylonian Genesis, deals with the creation stories out of Babylon, but there's a chapter in here that compares those stories with the Old Testament, which is really very fascinating chapter to read. And then this really is for next week. We're going to be dealing with the Genesis 1 story, the 6 days of creation. But this author takes modern day physics and retells the creation story using what we know about modern day physics. So he rewrites that creation story, but it adds all of this other material that makes it into a harmonious scientific sequence, not just what you have in Genesis 1. So these 3 books, oh, and then the other one, we're going to be talking about snakes. It's in the story. The Serpent and the Goddess, the focus of this is on Celtic traditions, but there's an opening chapter that deals with Eve and her encounter with the serpent. So these are fun books. The Babylonian Genesis, the next one, it's called Let There Be Life. And the subtitle is A Scientific and Poetic Retelling of the Genesis 1 creation story. I think the best way for us to proceed. Oh, question, comment?
Question. The Babylonian Genesis, did that precede the Torah Genesis or did it come later?
From what I have read, the question is what came first, the Old Testament story of creation or the Babylonian? From what I have read, and I'm not real expert on that, is that the Babylonian stories preceded the Old Testament stories. And in fact, some scholars think that they plagiarized, the Old Testament writers plagiarized from the Babylonian antecedents. But I think that's generally assumed that they preceded the writing down of the Old Testament. What I would like us to do, and I don't see anybody here with a Bible in hand. If we were Bible-toting Baptists like I grew up, you'd always have your Bible with you. But what I would like to do is begin reading the story and then stopping to comment on the various parts of the story that we really need to focus on. I already gave you that reading from Phyllis Tribble, which really calls into question the patriarchal translations or interpretations of this story. And so we will be hitting on that quite a bit, but also there's other stuff that we need to remember. So the title of this is called The Yahweh Story of Paradise, chapter 2, 4b through 25. So we're dealing with this material in two sections. The creation story is section 1, and then the second part is the mislabeled fall story, because it should not be labeled the fall story, but that's how we've grown accustomed to it. So it begins with, in the day that Yahweh made the earth and the heavens, when no plant in the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. So that's similar, if you wish, to the Genesis 1 story, that the earth was without form and void. But that's the only place where there's any kind of parallel between this story and the Genesis 1 story. For Yahweh had not caused it to rain upon the earth. That's an interesting phrase, that rain is the important ingredient that didn't happen. And there was no one to till the ground. So there had not yet been the creation of Adam, the earth creature. And I might just back up that this story of creation, while the first story in Genesis 1 is all about the creation of the whole cosmos, this story is only basically about the creation of humanity. So it's a very different focus from the get-go. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Then, this is right at the beginning, then Yahweh formed the human one. Now there's, in most bad translations, it says man. That is a mistranslation, because it really should be the human one, or if you want to use the Hebrew, it's Adam, not Adam, Adam, Adahm, is the human one. Formed the human one of dust from the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. That's the very crux of this story. It's about the creation of humanity and then the sequence following that creation. And it's interesting to note that the breath of life is fundamental to it. You might remember the story from Ezekiel about this vast field of dry bones. And the culmination was when the earthman was told to call the winds from the four directions. And they entered these skeletons and they became alive. So the breath of God is a continuing theme throughout really the Old Testament. Okay, and Yahweh planted a garden in Eden. Nobody knows where Eden is, but they get a little hint of it, because then it follows by saying, in the east. And there God put the human one who he had formed. And now we get the rest of creation. And out of the ground Yahweh made to grow every tree that is planted, pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the middle of the garden. That image of tree of life is a common image in ancient creation stories. There's always a tree of life. The problem is about the second tree, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's no other story in any of these other creation stories of a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So some scholars believe that these were two conflated stories that sort of merged together into the Garden of Eden. So then, this is beginning verse 10, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. And there it divided and became 4 rivers. Remember the first session we had? The Lakota, 4 directions, how important that was to their whole conceiving of the world. These are not identified by 4 directions, but it's important that it was 4 rivers because only 2 of which are known. So the name of the first is Pishon. There's been all kinds of speculation about where Pishon is, but there's no clear identification of it. Some people say it's even going all the way to the Nile. So, and then it is the one that flows around the whole of Havilah, where there is gold, another gold rush, I guess, and the gold of the land is good. Bdellium and onyx stones are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. Again, no geographical identification of where Gihon is. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. And nobody knows really what the land of Cush is. There was a misinterpretation of one of the sons of Noah who was named Cush. And somehow he was misidentified as the ancestor of Africans. But there's no connection to that whatsoever. It's a total misinterpretation. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. Well, if you know your geography, those are the 2 rivers that empty up into what was then Babylon or modern day times. So we know those 2 rivers, we don't know the others. And of course, there's been endless speculation about the Garden of Eden's got to be somewhere near here. And of course, and they never found it, just like trying to find the ark. Then Yahweh took the human one and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. That's a primary vocation of the human one, of people, period, is to till the ground. This, one of the things that you might remember in the story, remember the story of Cain and Abel? Cain was a herdsman. Abel was a farmer. And they both brought their offerings to God, and God blessed Abel, but did not bless Cain. And so Cain, in his anger, killed Abel. It's that conflict going way early on and into our own history in this country between herdsmen and agriculturalists. And so in this story, am I need to move over? Well, okay, I'm reading from here, so just move the camera. Okay, how about that? So Yahweh, and then Yahweh commanded the man, saying, here's where the prohibition sort of creeps in. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat it, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. This is not a death sentence. It's not like if Adam never ate from the tree, he'd be living forever. He'd be living now. It's more a recognition that no matter what we do, we're going to die at some point. So then we're getting now to verse 18. Then Yahweh said, "It is not good for the human one to be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So out of the ground, Lord Yahweh formed every beast of the field, every bird of the air, and brought them to the human one to see what he would call them. And whatever the human one called every living creature, that was its name. So in this story, different than what we will do with next week, the creation of animal life, birds, animals, insects, fish, all came after the human one was formed. It's a total reversal of what you have in the creation one story. And then the part that's interesting is that his task was to name them. Does that sound at all like our modern day scientific enterprises? We're all about naming stuff. If you're a biologist, if you're a botanist, if you're a zoologist, you go and get to play with whatever it is and you name it. And if you're famous enough, it'll get named after you. But so that is built into the story. Now, part of the naming is you have power over what you name. And that sort of motif follows along in lots of different stories, a lot of scientific stories and a lot of other kind of stories, because it's the power of the namer. So the human one gave names to all cattle, showing that even though it was a garden, cattle were important, and to the birds of the air and to every beast of the field. But for the human one, there was not found a helper fit for him. So the creation of all of the life was not culminated until the creation of the woman. It's not a second-hand thing. It's not an afterthought. It's part of the culmination of the whole creation process. So Yahweh caused a deep sleep to fall upon the human one. Deep sleep is almost like being comatose. It's not like taking a sleeping pill. It's putting the human one into an altered state of consciousness, would be probably a one way of thinking of it. And while the human one slept, Yahweh took one of the ribs, closed it up in its place with flesh, and the rib which Yahweh had taken from the human one was made into a woman, and he brought her to the human one. This is the creation of the duality of male and female. Up to this point, the human one, Adam, was, as Phyllis Treble says, androgynous, neither male nor female. The human one encompassed both of those. It was only at this point that there's the separation of the sexes. And from the point of view of the hearers of the story, that's important because that's the reality we live in. We have humans that are male and humans that are female. And then and this is important, this is an important part of it. The human one said, "This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of the human one." There is no sense in this story of superiority of the male over the female, because the focus is they are both taken bone of bone, flesh of flesh. A lot of biblical interpreters have made it into a patriarchal kind of thing and said that males are top dog because they were first, and then the woman was secondarily made out of the male. That's not in the story. It's a misreading of the story. So, yes.
I even heard that, that she was created after the animals, that she was even lesser than the animals in the creation.
Yeah, okay. The comment was that since woman was created after the animals, she was lesser than even the animals. This is a total misreading of the story, because in the story, woman was the culmination of creation, not the aftermath, not the, oh, we have to do something different. She was the culmination of creation. And in the mind of the writer of the Yahwist account, this creation of male and female was the culmination of the creation story of humans. Is that so? When you see that, just say this junk. All right. Therefore, a man, and I'm going to use that word here, leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. We'll hear more about the shame business later on. This has been interpreted that the man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. It's actually a reversal of what normally happens in Hebrew society. In Hebrew society, the woman leaves her natal family and goes to her husband's family. So that's an interesting reversal of the normal pattern that happens.
I wonder why that switched.
Well, I think the focus of the story, wondered why that switch happened, is the focus of it is they become one flesh. Because that's what Adam, the earth creature, said at the very beginning. This at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. They are two similar rather than two different people. And traditions that wanted to make female particularly secondary to male is not connected in this story. All right, so the point about not being ashamed, that appears later in the next part of the story, where they are ashamed after they eat the fruit. But maybe if you go to a free beach in France, maybe you're right there where it should be. So that's the end of this first part of the story. Any more comments or questions? Any from Zoom about this first part before we get into the second part? Yes.
Is it the writers, the writers of this down, or is it a modern translation? The use of the his, him pronoun. That's all we use. It was androgynous, but this pronoun is always his.
You are okay. The comment is about the use of male pronouns, not only for people, but for God. It's a fault of the English language because we don't have a pronoun that easily encapsulates both male and female. I mean, some writers do he / she as, but that's not a really good way of writing. So in the past, translators would use the male pronoun and just say, well, this is the way it is. More recently, probably in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly feminist writers are saying this is unacceptable. We can't continue to use male pronouns for people who are neither male nor female or female. Yes.
The trans community has given us a gift, and that is to name the pronoun as a plural.
Mhm.
People who are trans often consider their pronoun as to be
They.
and them, and
Mhm.
rather than he, she, it, whatever.
And our proper English speakers have a hard time with that.
And it's hard to say, it has to be a they.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that is a gift of the trans community that we can use a plural pronoun. We just have to learn how to get along with it. So, all right, any other comments or questions about this first part of the story? All right, now let's go to what is called the question here. That's right.
Trying to think of the author's name, but
Well, when you remember it, come back.
it's worth it.
All right.
It's a good and interesting comment, but I keep thinking of Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's not that, it's that Negro, that African-American writer who has that three-part name. And he wrote a poem about creation. And when I was teaching at the cathedral school in the church in the cathedral in Detroit, my students at chapel would act out a Bible story. So we had the one about creation. And so Ralph Walton Johnson. His last name is Johnson. And the words say something like, and this God, this great almighty God, knelt down in the mud and formed man out of the stuff of the earth. And it was so stirring
Mhm.
to read how he wrote that moment of making man. Made a deal out of this
Right.
God.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Aiming to dig in the mud and form man.
Good. That's a good story.
Well, it's not very good because I can't be sure.
Well, it's a good story.
He also wrote some of our hymns.
Oh.
Tell us next week, after you get that all straight.
All right. So the next section of the Yahweh story of creation is called in English, the story of the fall. It is a terrible name for this story, but it's based on centuries of theologians who have weighted down their negative images of Eve because she's the cause of the fall. And so it's labeled still as the fall. If I was going to label this story, I would call it the birth into consciousness, because it's really more of a birthing story, I think, than a fall in punishment story. But that's the label that you'll find Probably in any Bible that you pick up, it'll be about the fall. So it begins with the serpent. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that Yahweh had made. Subtle is probably not the right word. It would be clever. It would be wise. It would be a creature that could dialogue with humans. So the serpent is an important figure in this story. And I need to make you clear that in a lot of ancient traditions, the serpent is a sacred animal. And it's based partly on the morphology of serpents. Serpents have a habit of, at least in our climate, of hibernating and then coming back out of hibernation, almost like a resurrection story. There's a mythic image of snake swallowing its tail or biting its tail and being a circle. So that has that kind of imagery within. So in a lot of ancient traditions, including our own Native American traditions, the serpent is a really very powerful sacred symbol. Yes?
Is the Bible the only source that makes a negative image of snake?
The question is the Bible the only place that makes the negative image of the snake? It's more to do with theologians looking at this story and making negative interpretations. For example, often the snake is referred to as Satan. There's no connection between the serpent story in here and Satan. In fact, she doesn't even, as such, she doesn't function even like Satan does in the book of Job, for example, of testing or trying the woman. She just has a dialogue.
What about tempting though?
She doesn't do any tempting. She just corrects, if you wish. We'll get to that. Corrects the understanding that the woman has about what God said. So the negative things that have been put on the serpent, it's not so much part of the biblical tradition. It's more what theologians have done with this story in the centuries following. All right, so the serpent said to the woman, "Did God say that you should not eat of the tree, any tree of the garden?" That's a good kind of question to begin a dialogue with. You know, what are the limits? What can you eat and what can you not eat? And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but Yahweh said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden." She doesn't even identify which of the two trees it is, because probably in the earliest story, there was one story about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and another story about the tree of life. And then in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. She adds that little bit of information about touching it, which is not in the original story. But I guess if you're going to eat of it, you have to touch it. So anyway, for God knows, okay, now I'm back up. But the serpent said to the woman, "You shall not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So that's the dialogue that the serpent has with the woman. Phyllis Tribble, I gave you that writing that she does a rereading of this whole story. She was cavalierly making the comment one time, I think it was in a class. She said, the only reason why the serpent talked to the woman is because she was the only one he could have an intelligent conversation with. So anyway, but this is the crux of what the serpent says. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That's a good theological statement by the serpent, isn't it? I mean, isn't that the quest of anyone, is to know the difference between good and evil? We struggle with that all the time in our lives. So if we know that, and you will be like God, the question comes up later on, if God in the first story created humans to be like God, why in the hell is God so vexed with these two people who are trying to be like God? That's another interesting question. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, that's the key. She took of the fruit, ate it, and she gave some to her husband, and he ate. There's nothing in this story at that point of the woman tempting the man to eat the fruit. There's nothing about the man saying, oh no, we shouldn't eat that fruit. There's nothing in that story about the woman being a temptress to the man, but she is made into that by centuries of theologizing about this story. She took the initiative, and some people have said, well, maybe that's part of a feminine intuition. I don't know, but she took the initiative to try the fruit.
She was curious.
Yes, that was the comment that was made. She was curious. She wanted to know why shouldn't we eat of that fruit? And you know countless other stories, Pandora's box and others, where somebody is tempted to do something because it was forbidden. So this story follows a similar kind of theme. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked. That goes back to the earlier comment about being naked. There's something about human culture that wants to clothe people. My missionary parents couldn't stand these African women going around half naked, flashing their breasts, and so they had to put clothes on them because somehow nakedness was a reversion from what we want to do in civilized society. So they both knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. By the way, in a lot of early cultures, particularly South American, sewing together leaves was not an uncommon kind of way of covering your pelvic area. If you grew up in a culture where you had skins, you could do that, but if not, then leaves was a good substitute. Then we get to the next section. And they heard the sound of Yahweh walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man, now we are back to the man, Ish and Isha, and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord, of the presence of Yahweh among the trees of the garden. So here's the shame part. Not only are they naked, but also they're ashamed to meet their God because of the forbidden dictum that God gave. But Yahweh called out to the man and said to him, now God doesn't call to both of them, he just calls to the man, to Ish, and said to him, where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. So there's the shame of breaking a dictum, of an edict from God. And then Yahweh says, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? And here we have the story about people blaming each other. So the man said, well, the woman who you gave to me to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate it. Does that not sound so familiar? And then Yahweh said to the woman, what is this that you have done? And the woman said, now another blame thing, the serpent beguiled me and I ate. So blame goes all the way around. I mean, how clever a writer is the Yahweh Story writer, because he picks up in the story these very human qualities that is part of our humanity. We don't like to deal with the consequences of our actions, and so we blame somebody else. And it's no indication, by the way, in when the man says the woman gave to me and I ate, he doesn't say she tempted me. She just said she gave it to me and I ate it. So then we come to what is often called the curse, and it's misinterpreted. Are we done? No, I don't think so. Yahweh said to the serpent, now the serpent is the first one who gets the axe, if you wish. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above all wild animals. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Some people have said that this story is an origin story, which you have a little kid sitting around the campfire saying, why do snakes not have legs? Why don't they walk around like everybody else? Well, the story tells the reason why snakes don't walk around. Yes.
It could mean that the life of the snake was in trees before that time. Because otherwise, why would he be cursed by walking, sound level? Before that, he must have been somewhere else.
Well, probably where that
David, make sure
falls.
that you're repeating comments from classroom.
Oh,
We
the
have a
question
couple on
is,
Zoom that can't
the
hear.
comment is made that maybe snakes were arboreal initially, and then they became land creatures. The reality is nowadays there are snakes that are arboreal. In Africa, there's the green mamba, which lives only in trees. And there's other snakes that live in trees. So snakes, like all other forms of life, have adapted to different environments that they live in and that they occupy. And if you're a snake and you want to get a little bird for lunch, you learn how to climb trees. And there you go. So probably, I mean, you could make a story of that, but it's probably not very likely. I mean, the reality is snakes are snakes, but what's important in this part is that the snake is cursed. There's no cursing of Adam or of Eve. There's consequences, but there's no cursing of their behavior, whereas the snake is cursed. And then it continues on, and this is where all kinds of Christian theologians have made much ado about this. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. That gets all to the context of Jesus. And Jesus, who came to heal and was lifted up. Remember the image, lifted up as a serpent in the wilderness, lifted up on the cross. He came to save humanity. And they make that correlation, as far-fetched as that is. That's the theological thread that comes out of this very creation story. And I've heard, and I'm probably you have, I've heard sermons that make those kind of connections very explicit. And there's no connection that way, but if you're a theologian, you can do whatever you want to. So that's what he says, Yahweh says to the serpent. Then to the woman, Yahweh says, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, who shall rule over you. You might remember Phyllis Tribble had quite a few words to say about that, because if you read it kind of literally, it gives license to the male to be dominating. Her sense about it is that it's acknowledgement about the way cultures tend to operate, that males, not only amongst humans, but also other forms of life, tend to be the dominant force. But it's the rule over you that is the catchy one. And it's hard to get around that if you're going to be any attempt to have equality between males and females. But the focus of that story is that the primary vocation of the woman is to bear children and to attach herself to her husband. And that is a reality of human cultures. So, by the way, there's no curse involved in that. It's only acknowledging that that's the reality that she's going to be living with. And then
Let me repeat this too. This is a descriptive rather than a prescriptive.
yes, I think that's a good point to make. It's a description of reality, not a prescription, not a curse. This is just the reality. This is human reality. This is the way things tend to be. And there's few cultures in the world where there's a reversal of that, where the women have power and the men do not. There's a few, but not very many. Most most cultures, even traditional cultures, have a kind of patriarchal hierarchy between males and females. Some lot less onerous than others, but it's still sort of there.
We're working on it.
That was the comment. We're working on it. All right. So then to the man, Yahweh said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. And here's where it gets into the trickiness about the temptress, because he listened, but the story doesn't say he listened to her as if it was tempting. It was just like, I took the fruit and it was good. Have some. And have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you. And by the way, the command came to the androgynous person, Adam, before the creation of the woman. But she knows the story. You shall not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. Now, he's not cursing Adam. He's cursing the ground. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. That's reality, isn't it, of being a farmer? I know I have to pull out weeds from my garden all the time. So I don't think of the ground as being cursed, but it is the reality. In the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Remember that almost at every funeral service, that's the little refrain that is done. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So there's a longer listing of stuff for the male than there is for the female. I mean, for the female, it's just she will have hard pregnancies and birthings. She'll attach herself to her husband, and he will have power over her. But here's a whole list of things to the male, again, because it was an agricultural orientation in this story. It was dealing with the realities of what it means to be an agriculturalist, a farmer. Okay. The man called his wife's name Eve. Notice the word called. He did not name her Eve like he named the animals, because naming the animals implied a dominance over the animals. He called her, which is a wholly different verb in the Hebrew tradition. Yes?
But I've got the new Revised Standard Version, and it says, the man named his wife Eve.
Yeah, well, that's not the best translation,
Other
but
translations, what do you have there?
Called,
Okay. What translation?
St. James.
Okay, King James
King James.
has called his wife's name.
Yeah.
Okay, so King James had it good.
one of the things you'll find is if you,
David, can you please repeat that comment for the people on Zoom?
the comment was about whether Adam called or named Eve. If he named Eve, that would imply a dominance over her. If he called her, that is more of a term of equality than it is of dominance over. And the point I would like to make is that if you got out all your Bibles and compared a story like this, you would find a fair amount of difference in specifics like that, but even sometimes in the whole tone of the story. This one book I mentioned to you, the book of J, it has a whole different reading of this story, which I would tend to use, but I'm using the more traditional one that we're used to. So that's Old Testament literature, because of the manner in which it is written and the ambiguity of verbs and adverbs, it's often difficult to know just how to translate something. So, and I never took Hebrew in seminary. I took a little bit of Greek, which does me no good at all. But so, okay. So the man called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for the man and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. So there's another kind of correlation there between the agriculturalist and the herdsman, because they would not have garments of skin unless they were herdsmen. So they had goats and cattle that they could make skins from. Then Yahweh said, behold, the man, and now he's reverting back to the Adam, or the earth creature, has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, the two trees, and eat and live forever. Therefore Yahweh sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. That's the end of the story. Again, it's reverting to the generic term for the man, or the Adam, at the end of this story. It's sort of like it wasn't only the male that was forbidden to enter, it was the male and the female, a generic androgynous male. So that's the second part of the story, which I would call the birthing story of creation. I've not read that in any commentaries, but I think that's the proper way to interpret the story. Judith.
Okay, I'm looking at verse 22. Then the Lord God said, see, the man has become like one of us.
Mhm.
What would the us there refer to? God and angels, God and the Trinity, God and serpents,
I think the redactor okay, it's a question about in this part of the story, God says they will become like us. The redactor, who is again the person who puts this all together in a coherent form, not the earliest, but the Eloise story says when we come to the creation of humanity, God says, let us make them like us, male and female. So I think it's a turking to them. It's an acknowledgement that God is not just a male figure, which is what we have tended to do until we get to the Trinity in the New Testament. Then we think, oh yeah, God is more than just a male figure. But I think that feminist theologians particularly have been able to show that there's imagery in the Old Testament of God of being not just male, but inclusive of male and female. That's what I would say to that. Yes.
A while back, I was reading in the Christian Century magazine, one of the articles, and this person said that when God pushed Adam and Eve out of Eden, it was like the birth canal.
Mhm.
They were in a womb where they learned about and grew in knowledge of God. But the minute they knew about good and evil, they had become, as you said, conscious. And so they had to get out of there. They knew what was the world was going to be like. Now they're going to go out and experience it. It was sort of like a happy time rather than a punishment time.
So the comment is about this expulsion from the garden being not unlike the thrusting forth of a baby out of the womb. Because the womb, I'm embellishing a little bit your comments, but the womb is a perfect world. The baby living in the womb has all the nutrients that it needs. It has a safe, cuddly environment. It's a great place to leave, but they can't stay there. And so they get expelled in the birth process, which is not an easy process, both for the woman and the baby, but they get thrust out into the real world where they can learn to live. And so similarly, the comment she was making was that similarly, when Adam and Eve, or Adam, the earth creature, and the woman were expelled from the garden, it was not unlike being expelled out of the womb in a birthing story. I think that's a very apropos analogy of how to look at this story. Any other comments or questions? Anything from Zoom? Well, before we do another one from her, anything from Zoom? Nothing? Okay.
This lady, I forgot her name. Anne, went right to her little calculator and said that this author, this African-American author's name is James Walden Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an author I'm not familiar with, but
Well,
I'll.
he done a couple of Episcopal.
What was the comment, David?
The comment is that the person that was referred to earlier was James Walden Johnson, is the name of the author. And we'll all look it up, right? On our Googles and whatever. All right.
Check your hymnal.
You said he wrote some of the hymns that are in the hymnal? Okay.
One, and I can't think which one it is, of course.
Yeah. I'll look it up. All right. Anything more from either the classroom or the Zoom crowd? Well, I guess we're done with Genesis 2, and next week we do Genesis 1.
Story from the J book, or is it too hard for you to find?
No, I can read it.
Hard to see how that would go.
Well, let me just read the whole thing because it's really, it's nicely written and you'll hear it differently. The author of this book doesn't break it up verse by verse in the way that we're used to, because remember, verses, chapters were not part of the original document. The original documents did not break it up that way. So he breaks up his verses by paragraphs. So, before a plant of the field was in earth, before a grain of the field sprouted, Yahweh had not spilled rain on the earth, nor was there one to work the land. Yet from the day Yahweh made earth and sky, a mist from within would rise to moisture the surface. Yahweh shaped an earthling from clay of this earth, blew into its nostrils the wind of life. Now look, human becomes a creature of flesh. Now Yahweh planted a garden in Eden, eastward, settled there the human one he formed. From the land Yahweh grew all trees, lovely to look upon, good to eat from. The tree of life was there in the garden, and the tree of knowing good and bad. Out of Eden flows a river. It waters the garden. Then outside branches into four. One, Pishon, winds through the whole of Havilah, land with gold, excellent gold, were the Bebdelium and the Lapsus Luzo. And the second named Gihon moves through the length of Cush. Tigris, the third, travels east of Asher, and Euphrates is the fourth. Yahweh lifts the human one, brings him to, now that's a different image here, brings him to rest in the Garden of Eden, to tend it and watch. From all trees in the garden you are free to eat. So Yahweh desires the human one to know, but the tree of knowing good and bad you will not touch. Eat from it, said Yahweh, and on that day death touches you, which is a different thing than the King James says, you will die. Death touches you. It is no good for the human one to be alone, said Yahweh. I will make a partner to stand beside him. So Yahweh shaped out of the soil all the creatures of the field, the birds of the air, bringing them to the human one to see how he would call them. And whatever the human one called became the living creature's name. Soon all wild animals had names the human one gave them, all birds of the air and creatures of the field. But the human one did not find his partner among them. Now Yahweh put the human one into a deep sleep. And when he fell asleep, he took a rib, closed the flesh of his side again, starting with the part taken out of the human one. God shaped the rib into woman, returned her to the side of the human one. This one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, said the man. Woman, I call her, not of man she was parted. Out of man she was parted. So a man parts with his mother and father, clings to his wife. They were one flesh. And look, they are naked, man and woman, untouched by shame, not knowing it. Now we get to the second story. Now the snake was smoother tongued than any wild creature that Yahweh made. That's a different phrase. Did God really mean, the serpent said to the woman, you can't eat from any tree of the garden? But the fruit of the trees we may, said the woman to the snake. Just the tree in the middle of the garden. Yahweh said, you can't eat from it, you can't touch without death touching you. Death will not touch you, said the snake to the woman. The God, the Yahweh knows on the day you eat from it, your eyes will fall open like God's, knowing good and bad. Now the woman sees how good the tree looks to eat from, how lovely to the eyes, lively to the mind. To its fruits she reached, ate, and gave to her man there with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both fell open, grasped knowledge of their naked skin. They wound together fig leaves, made coverings for themselves. Now they heard Yahweh's voice among the evening breezes walking in the garden. They hid from the face of Yahweh, the man and his woman, among the trees of the garden. Where are you? Yahweh called to the man. I heard your voice in the garden, he answered, and I trembled. I knew I was smooth skinned. I hid. Who told you naked is what you are? He asked. Did you touch the tree I desired you not to eat? Interesting, different phrase there. Did you touch the tree? Oh, the woman you gave to stand beside me, she gave me fruit of the tree and I ate. What is this you have done? Said Yahweh to the woman. The smooth-tongued snake gave me and I ate. Since you did this, said Yahweh to the snake, you are bound apart from flocks, from any creature of the field, bound to the ground, crawling by your smooth belly. Dirt you shall taste from first day to last. I make you enemy to woman, enmity bound between your seed and hers. As you strike his heel, he shall strike your head. To the woman, he said, pain increasing groans that spread into groans, having children will be labor. To your man's body, your belly will rise, for he will be eager above you. A little sexual play in that, isn't there? To the woman, he said, you bent, or to the man, he said, you bent to your woman's voice, eager to eat from the tree of which you know my desire, you will not eat from it. Now bitter be the soil to your taste. In labor you will bend to eat from it each day you live. Thorns and thistles will bloom before you. You will grasp the bitter herbs the field gives you. As you sow the sweat of your face, so shall you reap your bread till you return to earth. From it you were taken, dust you are, to dust you return. The man named, and it says named, but I think called is a better word. His wife, Eve, she would have all who live smooth the way, mother. Now Yahweh made clothes from skins of the wild animals, for the man and the woman dressed them. Look, said Yahweh, the earthlings see like one of us, knowing good and bad. And now he may blindly reach out his hand and grasp the tree of life as well and eat and live forever. So Yahweh took him out of the Garden of Eden to toil in the soil from which he was taken. The earthlings were driven forward now, settled there east of Eden, the winged sphinxes in the weaving sword, both sides flashing, to watch the way to the tree of life. Isn't that a beautiful kind of poetic reading? It flows in a way that the biblical story doesn't. So there we are. I'm going to put these books out here for anyone who wants to borrow. You only have until next week. Next week we do Genesis chapter 1 through 2:4. And it's the famous story that we know so well. 6 days of creation, 24 hours each, right? So we'll have fun with that. Thank you.
If anybody has a question in Zoom and wants to put their camera on and unmute themselves, I would encourage you to do that now. It looks like the classroom is quiet at the moment.
A question from Zoom? Did you say?
No, not at the moment, not not typed in, but I'm saying if someone on Zoom wants to unmute themselves and
Oh.
share a question or comment, now would be a good time.
We have time, yeah. Maybe they're all asleep.
At the Wind. You ever see that movie with Spencer Tracy's
What's the title of it?
Inherit the Wind? It's the
Inherit the
story
Wind.
of dramatized story of the Scopes monkey trial,
Oh, really?
and
Wow.
it was made in the 50s, I think, and like I said, maybe 1960. Spencer Tracy plays the part of Clarence Darrow, I think it is, and can't think of the other actor's name. And it's a dramatization because the guy is arrested for teaching about monkeys and evolution.
Right,
And
right.
part of what happens on the stand is that the guy who's being examined, was referencing Genesis 1 about this and what God did this and so forth. And they get right down into it. Finally, the defense attorney says, "What is a day?"